Okay, hi everybody. This is the last year before Purim, which is creeping up on us, and very much looking forward to it. Hope everyone has their costumes ready. Tonight we are going to discuss Achashverosh, the third male in the Megillah in the series. As we heard from the first two, each year stands on its own, and tonight we want to focus on Achashverosh. How do we evaluate his character? And for some reason, every year when I read the Megillah, it gnaws at me while I'm reading the Megillah, and I have the same question that never, I don't know, I can never, I never feel satisfied for any of the answers. And um, my question is always, was Achashverosh brilliant or really stupid, right? And it sounds lavdil, maybe not lavdil, but similar to Donald Trump, that I've asked this question as well. Is Donald Trump, right, really, really clever because he was able to rise to so much power to become the world leader the way that Achashverosh was? Or his behavior points in the opposite direction, which makes it confusing in terms of what is the character of the person here. So today we're going to focus on two occurrences in the Megillah. Even though the king appears throughout, he appears throughout the whole Megillah in almost every scene, whether he's the active person or he's in the background, but he's there throughout. And this might point us in the direction of possibly Professor Rav Yoni Grossman asks the question, who is the main character? Who is the hero of the Megillah? And he goes through all the different options. And he one of the suggestions is Achashverosh, because Achashverosh, the whole Megillah begins with Achashverosh and ends with Achashverosh, and that's kind of like the frame, the literary frame of the entire story. It opens and closes with him. So tonight we're going to begin by looking into the feasts that open up the Megillah, and also which make us wonder how necessary it is for all these details to be included. What is the connection, right, between the feasts, these grand feasts that he has, and all the details of this Persian king to the story of the Jewish salvation? It's not so clear. Okay, if we look in Parak Aleph, in Esther Parak Aleph, we see here, Bishnat Shalosh L'Malcho, it's in the third year of his ruling, Asa Mishtel L'chol Sarav V'Avadav, Chel, Paras, Umadai, Apartumim, V'Sarei HaMedinot Lefanav. He gave a banquet for all the officials and the courtiers, the administration of Persia and Mada, the nobles, the governors of the provinces in his service. בהראותו את עושר כבוד מלכותו ואת עיקר תפארת גדולתו. And yamim rabim, shmonim u'ma'at yom. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. ובמלאת הימים האלה עשה המלך לכל העם הנמצאים בשושן הבירה, למגדול ועד קטן, משתה 7 ימים בחצר גילת ביתן המלך. At the end of this time period, whether it was the last week of the 180-day feast, or whether it was after that feast had concluded, it seems to be that it was parallel, that it was the last week. At the end of this time period, he has this feast of 7 days for all of the people that are present in Shushan. So here in this Parak Aleph, we start to see sort of that the author is scorning, in a way, of the king and his values, his world values. The king is coming here to display. He comes here to in this Mishnah, in the first feast, he's coming here to display his osher v'kavod malchuto, his wealth and his honor. And in the second feast, b'yom hashvi'i ketov le'melech, at the end of the story, the 7th day, when he was really happy and merry with wine, this is when he honors Vashti to come. Lavit Vashti hamalka. Liflei Melech, he wants her to come with the crown. Leharot, we see once again, that word is highlighted. Beharoto, we saw it here with his glory and his wealth. And here it's Leharot Hamim Vasarim Et Yofa. He wants to show the beauty of his wife. And as Professor Yonatan Grossman, and I just want to say that this whole shir is based on a series of his shiurim, and I recommend reading all of them because he is just one of the most brilliant Tanakh minds out there. His wife, she is just part of his wealth and his splendor, just to display. And as we see this whole through the text, there's no direct communication between Achashverosh and his wife. We see the request that it's here. He says to his officers, Lemehuman, Bista, Charvona, all the 7 eunuchs are here. He asks them to bring Vashti. And she refuses, Vatama'ela Malka, she refuses to come, and she tells through the eunuch she's not speaking to him directly. There's no communication. And here she's just really part of this whole display that's going on. So Rav Yoni Grossman wants to point out that through a hint to another feast, the author is criticizing the pretentiousness of Achashverosh by confronting it with Melech Shlomo. King Shlomo also has a feast in the 3rd year of his kingdom, as we see in Malachim Aleph Perek Bet. Vayim miketz shalosh shalim, at the end of 3 years, that we have the story of Shimei, and after the story of Shimei, he gets rid of the last threat to his kingdom. And the end of that same perek, it says Hamamlacha lechona biyad Shlomo, that the kingdom was set in his hands. He got rid of the last threat. We see that he's finally able to settle down. And then immediately after that, in the 3rd year, after that, we see that he also has a feast, L'chol Avadav, in the 3rd year. But before this feast, there's that famous dream that happens in Givon, where he gets that promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what's that promise? What does he ask for? When Hashem asks him, what is it that you want? He asks, as we saw in Perek Gimel, V'natata lavdecha lev shomea, a heart that can hear, that can discern, lishpat otamcha, to be able to judge your nation, to understand between good and evil. Right? He wants to, his request is the highest level of request. He wants a lev shomea, a heart that's able to judge the nation that's standing before him. He, with this humility, he approaches God, and this is what he asks for. And Hashem says to him, and this is very good in God's eyes, and Hashem is really happy about it. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu points out, V'lo sha'ata lecha yamim rabim. Hashem said, you didn't ask for long life, and you didn't ask for riches, and you didn't ask for the life of your enemies, but you asked for discernment and judgment. And he says, this is what I'm going to give you. Natati lecha lev chacham v'navon asher kamocho lo ya lefanecha. I'm going to give you this wise and discerning mind that there's never been anyone like you before, and no one will be like you ever to rise again. And also, in addition to this, we see the osher and the kavod appears again, as we saw in the beginning, that idea of osher and kavod here, where he's showing his osher v'kavod. Beharoto, it's osher kavod malchuto. And we see that also. So it's not just, right? If it was just that both of these kings made a feast in their 3rd year, as it says at the end here, after he wakes up, he comes to Yerushalayim, and Vayas Mishtel L'chol Avadav, and he also makes a feast for his servants. If it was just that they both had a feast in the 3rd year, we wouldn't necessarily say that the author of the Megillah is trying to make a reference to the story of Shlomo. But because those words, Osher v'Kavod, the wealth and honor appears in both of their stories, and it's a central motif in both of the stories. By Achashverosh, we see that that's the whole purpose of it, is that he wants to show and display his wealth. And we see here as well the conversation in the dream between God and Shlomo, that Hashem recognizes that Shlomo doesn't ask for this, and he values what Shlomo asks for, and he also gives Shlomo this in addition to the Lev Shomea. Achashverosh, his feast, what he's displaying, it's exactly what Shlomo gives up on. He prefers this Lev Shomea. By Shlomo, when they have this feast, what are they celebrating? They're celebrating this Lev Shomea, this heart that's going to be able to judge the nation fairly. This alternative of a feast hints that this is exactly what Achashverosh is lacking. Achashverosh is lacking that Lev Shomea. Achashverosh is trying to imitate the kingdom of Shlomo through emphasizing his wealth and honor. The way, like Shlomo merited this, and we know that the wealth and honor that Shlomo had in the Beit HaMikdash, it was filled with splendor. It was beautiful. But it's only an imitation of the external part. He only saw the outside of it. He only saw, right, as the glitter, the gold. That's all that he saw. But he lacked that inner covering, that inner part. He didn't have the heart. He didn't have the heart. And so the connection between these two stories, when the author is bringing in the third year, bringing in these two words of Osher and Kavod, the author is alluding here that there's an alternative way, that there's a discrepancy, there's a rift between them. And there's also, we see that through the words Lemikaton v'ad gadol, as we saw in the beginning, we're going to go back up just to show us in the beginning, at the end of when the king has the second feast, when he makes a king for all the people that are in Shushan Bira, it says Lemigadol v'ad katan, from those who are older to those who are younger. Usually in Tanakh, it's the opposite. The order is in the reverse. It goes from katan legadol, from smaller to bigger. But there are two, Professor Yoni Grossman points out that there are two additional instances where we see this order is reversed as well, by the story of the king in Nineveh and the story of Melech Yoshiyahu. And just to see it inside, in Yonah, it says that after Yonah comes, the whole story of the tshuva, it explains the Vayaminu Anshe Nineveh, they believed in God and they called out a fast and they wore sackcloth, migdola vad ktanam, small, great and small alike. And then again, we see the same words as well in Yoshiyahu when he's renewing the covenant with the nation, the king Yoshiyahu, in Divrei Yamim, and he gathers the nation, and he gathers all the people, Vayal Melech Beit Hashem, and he goes up to the Beit HaMikdash, V'chol Ish Yehuda, and whoever's sitting in Yerushalayim, the Kohanim, the Levim, V'chol Ha'am, Migadol Vad Katan. Again, those words appear, which is rare, because usually, as we explain, it's the opposite. And he reads before them, Divrei Sefer HaBrit, he reads the covenant before them. And it's this big ma'amad, it's this, I don't know how to say ma'amad in English, but it's this ceremony that everyone here is standing here, and he's renewing this brit that seemed to have been forgotten. And he vayasar Yoshiyahu kol ha'toavot mikol ha'atzon lebnei Yisrael, and he takes away the idolatry that was going on. And from here we see that such a contrast between the feast of Achashverosh and with the words le migadol ad katan, to the instance that happens with the king of Nineveh, who's fasting, they're ripping their clothes, right? And the theme of clothes appears as well by Achashverosh, but by Achashverosh, he has this pride. He's displaying all the materials that he has, the cloth that he has, and while the king of Nineveh is ripping his clothes, and he's fasting. But by Achashverosh, what are they doing? They're drinking, they're eating. So beneath the surface, once again, the author is showing the scorn of Achashverosh, the king who invites all of Shushan to see his wealth, in contrast to Shlomo HaMelech, in contrast to the king of Nineveh, in contrast to the king of Yoshiyahu. There's this great rift where his feast is lacking any sort of spiritual dimension. The second instance, okay, so just to go over again, through the feast of Achashverosh, we can understand by comparing his feast to these other kings, one of them a Gentile king, the type of feast that he has, and the alternative feast of Melech Shlomo, and the other types of instances where those two words are used, Migadol Vad Katan, by the king of Nineveh, where they all repent, and by the renewal of the Brit of the king of Yoshiyahu. The second instance where we can really contemplate his character is Achashverosh and the evil decree of Haman. Now, here, as we see, if you look on the screen, on the right side, we have what Haman tells Achashverosh when he's convincing him about this decree that he wants to carry out. And on the other side, we see what Haman actually writes, what he sends out. In actuality, the letters that he sends out. Okay, so here, when we're looking, it says Vayomer Haman lemelech Achashverosh. Haman is talking to Achashverosh, and these are the famous psukim. He explains that there's this nation that's scattered and separated, and their religion is different, and they don't go by the dat of the king, and it's not worth it for him. En shovel halicham. It's not worth it for him. Le'abdam. Okay, this is the word that we're going to be using. It's going to be repeating itself. So remember this word le'abdam, which is in English you would say destruction. Okay, he's saying let me write it to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 kikar kesef, which was an exorbitant amount of money, by those who carry it out, and this money will go to the king. And the king agrees. Vayasar HaMelech, he gives him he takes off his ring, and this is where Haman reaches the pinnacle of his power. And Vayomer HaMelech LaHaman HaKesef Latulach, everything is given to you. V'ha'am lasot bo katov be'elecha. Do whatever you want. Okay, so we see here that the king acquiesces. He agrees to doing what Haman is asking. But here, Haman's intentions are opaque. It's not clear exactly what he's referring to. There's no concrete method exactly how this is going to be carried out. Now, in Tanakh, there are different meanings to the word of ibud, like la'abdam that we have highlighted in front of us. The most common explanation is annihilation, but there are other ways to explain it. For example, in Sefer Dvarim, when it's referring to the curses of the breed in the plains of Moab, it's referring to exile and loss of freedom. Okay, so here, it's possible that he may have led the king to understand le'abdam in an economic sense, to sell the nation as slaves. And when it shows what he writes in his letter, it's different. If you look here in Vayikru Sifrei HaMelech B'chodesh HaRishon, this is when it's sent out to everybody. V'lishlach svarim biyad haratzim, it's sent out lahashmid, laharog, ule'abed, to destroy, to kill, to destruct, right? There's a stark contrast to the explicit elaboration in the letters. It comes along with killing. His intent here is clear, whereas his intent in the conversation with the king is not clear. It's opaque. It's not clear how the king understood what he meant when he was saying la'abdam, because it seems that he was presenting his case in economic terms, which also makes sense because that's what speaks to the king. If it's not wealth and honor, then what else? That's what he cares about. Now, the deception, there are two further mentions of the decree later on in the Megillah, in Esther Perek Daled. Mordechai is telling Esther about the decree and what's going on. And it's interesting that in this part, there are three pieces of information and there's a request. Okay, so these three pieces of information that are going on here, here, the three pieces of information, it says here, Vayugadlo Mordechai et kol asher karahu. Mordechai tells Hatach, the intermediary between him and Esther, everything that had happened, and it would make sense that he's referring to what happened with the bowing down to Haman. And then he mentions the Parashat HaKesef and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. And again, that word la'abdam is appearing la'abdam. That patshegel ktav hadat asher natam, and also the written text of the law, which says lahashmidam, as opposed to la'abdam, to destroy them. That's what the letter has said. And the final request is to show her this and to tell her to go before the king and to plead for her nation. So why this? We can understand the first part, why he's catching her up on what happened, and we can understand that he's explaining about the decree of destruction and the request that he has of her. But why is he mentioning the second point about the payment? What does that add? What does that contribute to the story? Why is this detail important? So Haman presented his case in economic terms, but meanwhile, underneath the surface, he has this decree of annihilation. And Mordecai is conveying to Esther, this is the approach that you need to take. You need to come to the king and reveal to him that he was being misled. He was being deceived by his most trusted advisor. And so Mordecai, by using those two words of le'abdam and lehashmidam, he's pointing out the gap between what Haman said to the king and what he sent out, what was written in the letters. Now, Esther tells Achashverosh about this decree, and when they're having their second feast, when they're sitting down, and she's sitting down with Achashverosh and Haman, and he's asking her, what is your request? And she's saying to him, Vatan Esther Malka, תילתן לי נפשי בשאלתי ועמי בבקשתי. Give me my life and my people as my request, כי נמכרנו אני ועמי להשמיד, להרוג ולאבד, ואילו, and she explains, my people have been sold, which is interesting that she uses nimkarnu, okay? Because you would think that that's referring to being sold into slavery, but she goes on to explain, no, this is destruction. We have been sold to being destruction. But if we had been sold just to become slaves and maidservants, I would have been silent, because the adversary is not worthy of the king's trouble. But because it's a decree of annihilation, and it's not a decree of just being sold into slavery, I'm coming to you and I'm not silent. I won't go silent. I won't be speechless. And so he says, while at the same time indirectly giving the king the impression that his moral judgment is correct in judgment. For his part, he did agree to the nation being sold as servants and maidservants. And had this been the case, Esther hints, she would have remained silent, for the affliction of her nation would not have equaled the king's damage. However, against the king's sound judgment, Haman has acted behind the king's back, and the nation has been sold for annihilation and slaughter. Now, the most perplexing question that we have in the story is Achashverosh's reaction. And again, every year when I read this reaction, it's cringeworthy, because it's so difficult to understand, why is he reacting this way to what happened? Doesn't he know? He had that private conversation with Haman. We just read about it. In that private conversation where Haman told him that he would put money into the treasury, he would abdam, he would destroy this nation, and the king willingly took off his ring, gave it to Haman, and even though we don't know the exact amount of time that elapsed, how could he have possibly forgotten? It's really, this question is just so perplexing of his reaction. And just to read it inside, Vayomer Melech Achashverosh, and he says, Vayomer LaEsther HaMalka. In a minute, we're going to look at that, the double times. Why does it say Vayomer Melech Achashverosh? He says, Vayomer LaEsther, he says to Esther HaMalka. The Midrash picks up on it. It has a very interesting way of explaining it. Mi hu zeh Ve'ezehu, who is he and where is he who dared to do this? Which is also double language. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to use both of these words. And here she explains it's Ish Tsar Velyev, Haman Hara, it's this evil man. And here the king gets up, the Hamelach he gets up in his anger from the Yayin, and he goes out to his garden, and Haman is pleading for his life. This is that famous scene, and then he comes back and he finds Haman. Let's fall in on the bed where Esther is saying, and he says, you're also going to try to take over my wife while I'm in the house. And then here, Charvona comes and he comes to save the day, and he says that there's this tree of that Haman has made for Mordechai, and everything is turned over at this point. Haman's tree that was meant for Mordechai, Haman's decree that was meant for the Jews, everything falls down on him, a complete 180. And then Haman is hung, v'chamat hamelech shechacha, and the king's anger is coming down. So Professor Yoli explains that there are three exegetical approaches to this question of his surprise. So one of them could possibly be he's surprised that the decree applies to Esther and to her nation because he didn't know what her identity was, as Mordecai told her to hide her identity, and he didn't know that she belongs to this nation, and so this is what arouses his anger. Another possibility is that as part of this caricature of Achashverosh, the drunken, foolish king, he doesn't remember, right? So much is going on, and it was a little thing, and he forgot. And the third possibility, the third approach that we see is that the king actually knows who he is and where he is, but he pretends not to know. He doesn't want to show himself as someone that would agree to such a horrible thing, so he pretends. Professor Grossman disagrees with all of these approaches, and he explains that according to the simple meaning, it's hard to understand and to really resolve to this question with any of these approaches. And he wants to come and claim, as what we've been saying all along over here, that the king didn't know. The king actually did not know what that Haman had deceived him. He wasn't aware that this was a decree of annihilation, and that the anger that we see here, it's true anger, as we see in Ibn Ezra, Vayomer HaMelech Achashverosh, Vayomer, as we said, that we see that it's twice, and it seems superfluous. Why does it need to say Vayomer twice? Pa'amayim leharot she'amelech ka'as miyad. It's twice to show, it's coming to emphasize and show that the king was immediately angry. That was his instinctive reaction because that was his authentic reaction. And Umerov Kasov, from this great anger, Amar B'Bhirut, he said quickly, Mihu Zeh ve'ezu, twice, like, who is this and where is he? This is an authentic reaction coming from his belly because he was unaware. He understood something else from Haman. La'abdam, he understood it in the context of this economic presentation that he made on the PowerPoint for him. And meanwhile, Haman was referring to this decree of annihilating an entire nation. Now, the Midrash says something very interesting, that the reason why it says twice, Vayomer HaMelech Achashverosh, Vayomer le'Esther HaMalka, why does it say it twice? Amar Rav Abahu says, at first, Achashverosh would speak to Esther through a Torgamal, through an interpreter. But once she said that she comes from the line of Shaul HaMelech, he would speak to her directly. Fascinating midrash, right? And L'or Chadash also goes on to explain, very interesting. He goes on to elaborate on the words of Chazal, and that he explains that the reason why it says Vayomer twice is because now he's speaking directly with her. היינו שלא הייתה ראויה שתבוא הגאולה כי אם על ידי שהיה לאסתר חיבור גמור אל המלך אחשוורוש. It wasn't worthy. The redemption was not worthy of arriving unless there was a complete connection between Esther and Achashverosh. And this only occurred once he spoke to her pe'el pe, directly, not through an intermediary. Aval al yedei l'turguman en ze chibur gamur. Through an interpreter, this isn't a complete connection. Ki Achashverosh kol kach rasha haya. Okay, and here the Or Chadash is coming to say to the question, our question of the shir, was he a villain or a puppet? The Or Chadash wants to say, he claims, kol kach rasha haya. He was such an evil man. V'haya notel leHaman harasha legamrei. And he tended towards the side of Haman, who is a complete Rasha. Ve'al yedei Esther shehi tzadeket, but through Esther, she was a righteous one, higia lo hasiluk min harishut b'davar ma. He removed himself somewhat from this great evil of Haman. Ulekach tzarich she'eh la'Achashverosh chibur hagamor el Esther. And so therefore, there needed to be this complete connection between Achashverosh and Esther, v'haya lifrad me'aman rasha. He needed to be separated from Haman Rasha. And so therefore, when it says Vayomer twice, it's to show about this connection with Esther. And immediately afterwards, it says, Mi ze ve'ezehu gamkin, that question of who is it and where is he? Ki mikan ve'elach haya lifrad hachibor mehaman. Ki from here on in, that connection that he had with Haman was completely separated. V'haya mitchaber le'Esther, and he connected to Esther, she'al yada haya hagula, that through Esther was the redemption. Fascinating approach of the Midrash and this elaboration of the Or Chadash. And a question that I have for the audience, and Bezrat Hashem, remind me at the end to ask the audience, why do you think that the Or Chadash is saying, why would it be necessary for there to be a complete connection between Achashverosh and Esther in order for the Geula to arrive? Why is that necessary? I'm not really sure. Okay. Now, think about that, and Bezrat Hashem, at the end of the shir, let's get back to that question. Does Achashverosh take any responsibility in what actually, in this decree, and what happens? So in Esther, in Perek Chet, she comes to him at the end again, and she approaches him, and she says to him, and she asks him to take back, to revoke these letters that were written out with the machshavet, with the thinking of Haman Hagatati, asher katav le'abed et haYehudim. Again, that word le'abed et haYehudim, which is referring to the way that Achashverosh understood what Haman was talking about, right? It doesn't include the part of lehashmid uleharog. She's bringing this up, and she's saying to him, yes, you understood that it was to be sold into slavery, but yet still, there still should be some taking of responsibility, that even though you were misled, this still was written out in your name, and these letters have gone out. But Achashverosh, we see here that he takes zero responsibility, and he what he responds to her, I gave the house of Haman to Esther. The problem is gone. The problem has been removed. That he sent his hand against the Yehudim. I'm not involved in this. This was completely Haman, and he's taken care of. He's on that tree. Now, Professor Grossman, he brings in Zakovich, who has this article, which we won't go into all the details, but very interestingly, he compares the story with Achav, the king, and Izebel, who writes a letter unbeknowingly in the name of her husband to kill the Kohanim of Nov. And Achav is not aware of it, but she sends out the letters in his name. And we understand what the judgment of this, the judgment of Achav is by the reaction that the Navi brings from God to Achav by blaming Achav for this murder that was taken out, that was carried out in the name of the seal of the king without the king actually knowing. And so therefore, what we can understand from that story, we can understand as well how we are meant to see this situation, a similar situation, where Achashverosh, he didn't intend for this decree to be carried out. It was unbeknown to him, but yet it was still under his name. And so Zakovich says here, this narrative is not one of the Eliyahu narratives, the one about Achav and Izebel, nor a narrative showing the greatness of the prophet. It's not about Eliyahu here. Rather, it is a narrative that comes to teach a moral lesson. It is a fable or parable about a vineyard that belonged to, with its moral, that a ruler's responsibility extends to all actions that are undertaken in his name and by his authority, even if he seeks to ignore them and not to know about them. So same here, we can also project that same judgment onto what's going on with Achashverosh as well. Even if we take Professor Grossman's approach that Achashverosh was unaware, and aside from the fact that also selling a nation into slavery is also problematic in and of itself, but without touching upon that, okay? We're discussing the decree of annihilation. He was unaware of this decree of annihilation. and yet he still holds responsibility for what happened. This still happened under his rule, under the seal of his signature with his ring. And so therefore, it's still his responsibility, and yet he refuses to take any responsibility, even if he understood the word le'abed to mean to be sold into slavery as an economic case rather than as the actual physical destruction of a nation. So we come back down to our question of, was Achashverosh a villain or was he a puppet? And how do we understand his character? So um, Henschke, he has an article called Megillat Esther Tachposet Sifrutit, a literary costume, and it's also a very an interesting article. But what he comes to claim is that the main topic of the Megillat Esther is not at all having to do with the battle, right, between Haman and Mordechai. Ma'avak ze elo ela mikra mivchan. This is only really like a taste test. A test case that through it mitzayer bala megillah et ofya shemalchut Achashverosh. Through this battle between Haman and Mordechai, through it, it's coming to draw out to show us the character of the kingdom of Achashverosh, Hailu malchuto shel basar vadar, the kingdom of a flesh and blood, Hamelech. Betor shekazeh, the king, through this, hu nosah ha'amiti shel ha'megillah. He is the main topic, the main subject of the Megillah. Shelo ba ela lelagleg, that the Megillah is only coming to scorn him. Derech satira charifa, through this really sharp satire, al yimrat ha'malchut shel basar vadam, of this arrogance, of this type of kingdom of a flesh and blood. It's coming here to point that out. And he proves this by showing what we said in the beginning, how the Megillah starts off with Achashverosh and ends off with Achashverosh at the end as well, with the taxes that he has upon the nation, that we are still under his rule, and he still has the control of all of those 127 provinces. That's the framework of the story, and he's really the main subject here, and it's showing this it's coming here to scorn that type of kingdom that he has of through this really like a harsh sharp sort of satire. But he also, Rav Grossman also quotes the Dot Mikra, which I think also brings us to another dimension in understanding the king's place in the Megillah. And he says beautifully here in the last one, נראה שמחבר המגילה מעוניין שההתבוננות בשלטון לא שלטון זה תביא לידי הכרה. It appears to be that the author of the Megillah is interested that this contemplation of the rulership, which is not really a rulership, will bring us to the recognition and also just to expand upon that this rulership that he has, it's satirical because he can't even rule over his wife who refuses to come to him. He can't even rule over Haman, who's deceiving him and seeking out power, as we see when he comes to him and he wants and the king says, how can I honor somebody? He comes at night and the king says, how can I honor someone? And he thinks it's all about him, and he says, dress him in royal garbs, and he's seeking power. That's what he wants. He can't even control Haman, what's going on. This shilton lo shilton, this rulership that's not really a rulership, is coming to bring the recognition shelo hamelech hamituar b'megillah sholet b'mamlacha. Not the king that's described here in the Megillah is ruling this kingdom, ela shehamu'araut b'mamlacha zo nikva'im b'makom acher. Rather, the instances, the events of this kingdom are really established in a different place. They're really established b'makom acher, by Kadosh Baruch Hu, by the real king of the story, and that's the satire. That's what the Megillah is coming to show us, is that it's coming to show us that we have this king here that lacks that lev shomea that Shlomo HaMelech came, because the purpose of a melech in Israel is to bring the kingdom of a Kadosh Baruch Hu down to earth, to bring heaven to earth, to bring earth to heaven, to have that connection, right? But here with Achashverosh, there's such a rift between that spiritual kingdom that Shlomo HaMelech built and the feast and the materialism and the hedonism and the fact that he's not really a leader. Every decision he makes, he asks his advisors. He's being told what to do. He's being pulled in all different directions. It doesn't seem that he's the one that's actually pulling the reins, even though he's the one that's sitting upon the kisei malchut. He's sitting on the throne, but really the one that's pulling the strings of this puppet here is a Kadosh Baruch Hu. And whether or not we see Achashverosh as a villain or as an anti-hero character, I think that that's still a question. It's still a question that's up in the air that we can ask ourselves. Is he someone that's a bystander to an atrocity that was going to be carried out? How much responsibility does he have in this decree? And I can't help but be reminded of similar questions that came up in the Holocaust, of big commanders in the Nazi army that claimed when they were brought to justice, that claimed, I just did what I was told to do, or I didn't really know, or all different claims, right? Putting the responsibility of someone else. But what we understand from Achashverosh is that he was lacking that lev shomea, that heart to discern, to bring justice. There was no set justice. It was according to when he would extend his scepter and when he would not, and if he decided that he wanted to kill his wife, then he would kill his wife. And at first we have Haman, who he rises to power, and then that turns upside down, and then we have Mordechai that rises to power. But the same way, and there's so many allusions, as we spoke about also with Rebbetzin Hannah Bakes, that there's so many allusions to the story of Yosef, because the story of Yosef ends the same way as well. That he's in this exile, he rises to power, he makes this huge difference, but in the end, Vayakam melech chadash asher lo הכיר את Yosef, a new king comes up, and who doesn't know Yosef, and that's how the slavery begins. So here there's an allusion that at the end of the Megillah, we're in the same place. We know that that the next day he can find a different Haman to rise above Mordechai. And that here we have this king here that's going through the wind. So whether or not he's this active villain, or whether or not he's this anti-hero, or he's just pariv, or takes or doesn't take responsibility, whatever he is, he's still this puppet in this theatrical stage of the Megillah, that Hakadosh Baruch Hu is pulling the strings here, and the Megillah is screaming out and saying, it's kind of reminds me now as I'm thinking about it, that the story, I don't know if it's a book. It's called Are You My Mother? It's a famous classic book in America, children's book. And you see that the bird, it goes to the cat and goes to the dog and says, Are you my mother? Are you my mother? And it's searching because it falls out of its nest and it can't find its mother, until finally at the end it's taken back to the nest and rejoined with its mother, but it's seeking out its mother. And the Megillah as well, the author is saying to us, who is our king? Who is our real king? Are you my king? No, look at this king, this of flesh and blood. Look at Achashverosh. Look at this kingdom that he has. Seek out the real king. Understand who is really controlling all that happens underneath the surface. And really, that's what Purim is all about. It's not about looking at, like as the quote says, all that glitters isn't gold, right? It's not about just the chitzoniyut, the external part of what Achashverosh is trying to imitate from Shlomo Melech. He had the same gold. He had gold beakers, the way that Shlomo Melech had gold cups everywhere. He tried to imitate that, but he stopped at the external part. He didn't have that extra piece of that lev shomea. And Purim is really about dressing up, putting on masks, hiding our faces, so that we can really look inwards and try to figure out, who are we beneath all of this? Who is the one that is really ruling the world? And that is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, sorry, I just want to